Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and for a lot of you again today. After listening to me drone on and on forever last time, I was sure that none of you would come back. So it's great to see a bunch of people who have come back for the second part. So this is the second part of a two-part series that I've been doing, and I went ahead, if at the end of this you're interested, going back and watching the first part, I dropped into the chat a link to where you can find a recording of the first one. So the first presentation really focused on white nationalism in Montana from 1980 up to 2015. And for those of you that were on for that, you'll know that I was able to go pretty chronologically, and that's much easier to do when you're talking about mostly things that have happened and are done. The reality about right now and this time period that we're looking at, 2015 up till now, is still happening. And it's still happening in the fact that the word present is in the title, but also, as we'll see, many of the activities, including the picture here from the Charlottesville rally in 2017, there's still litigation going on involving some of the characters that we'll be talking about today. The first presentation, I was able to focus pretty much on Montana. This presentation, I will be talking a little bit more about developments that have happened at the national level. And as I'll talk about in a second here, one term or one dynamic that we talk a lot about at MHRN is margins to the mainstream. So how do these ideas that start out on the fringe, that start out in white nationalist circles, make their way into the political mainstream? Frankly, during this time period that we're looking at basically the highest levels of government in our country, at races for the highest offices, really provide very glaring examples of that dynamic. So I'll be talking maybe a little bit more about national events, but still we'll definitely cover the major things that have happened with white nationalism during this time period in Montana as well. And as Simone said, feel free to type questions into the chat, and we'll kind of go through those at the end. Okay, again, I'll warn those of you that were on the first time that these first few slides are going to look very familiar. Hang in there, don't worry, I promise there's new content coming. And frankly, some of this, I think if they're kind of new concepts and new ideas, it's not the worst thing to hear some of this a second time. So just a little bit about the organization that I work for. So we're a nonprofit based out of Helena that started in 1990. We have, 2,300 member households, some of whom have been with us for that entire existence. So we're basically into 30 years as an organization now. And the content of what I'm going to talk about today very much gets at the core of why MHRN was formed. We were formed by local community groups who were trying to respond to white nationalist and anti-government militia activity in their communities. And so this was happening all over the state in the late 80s, going into the early 90s. What had happened is these local community groups had formed, and really they were recreating the wheel every time. They all had very similar questions. Who are these groups? What are these ideas that they're talking about? And most importantly, what can we as a community do to respond? So quite a few of those groups came together in 1990 to basically talk about what was working, what wasn't working, what resources existed, what resources were absent. And out of that meeting came the idea that there should be an organization at the statewide level with paid staff that would help communities deal with these issues all the time. So in the beginning, we were very much a fight the racist right group. But then pretty early on, after 2, 3, 4 years, we really figured that this response work that we were doing is really important, and we wanted to continue that. But along with responding to the bad, we started to feel like, hey, we should be out there doing something to push forward the values that we wanted in our communities, that would help our communities look and function, and thereby the state look and function in the ways that we wanted it to. So we started to adopt a very kind of broad, progressive public policy agenda. One of the first issues we took on in 1992 and 1993 were LGBTQ rights. I always like to say that we've been doing that work before it was sexy. This was back before anybody else was really talking about those issues here in Montana. That public policy work has now grown to include, immigration rights, access to good and affordable health care, all sorts of different issues. I mean, when I meet people from other states who, know Montana and think of it as being very conservative, and they say, what does your group work on? A lot of times I'll just say, well, think of any policy work that you don't think would be happening in Montana, and MHRN is probably part of it. So that local group structure continues to be a big piece of who we are. We have about 10 local affiliate groups in Montana right now, and we really view the work that we do as being a three-legged stool. So we do a lot of public policy work, we do a lot of community organizing, and then sort of this Defending Democracy, Combating White Nationalism program that's more focused on opposition research and helping communities understand these far-right movements and respond to them. Okay, so the far-right ideological construct. This is really a construct that represents how these far-right groups are based around their ideology. And it really does encompass all of the different groups and movements that we follow, including the white nationalist movement. So far-right groups are conspiracy-based, and they're based around these notions that the system has failed or is failing, and that it's not just that the system is failing, but that it's being used by a quote-unquote them to get us. So what does that look like in the white nationalist movement? So the white nationalist movement is based around anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, where Jewish people are said to control the government, the media, the medical industry, basically everything. And that they're using that power that they have to persecute the white race. So these groups also really have and offer simple answers to complex questions. So let's say you're sitting at home, you're going about your day-to-day life, you go to work, you come home, all of a sudden you lose your job. And then after you lose your job, you're not able to make payments on your home, and then all of a sudden the bank is coming after your home. Now, the reasons for that are going to be really complex. They're going to involve, what's going on in your local economy. They're going to be, involved with what's going on in your state economy, in the region, in the country, and the world. There's going to be a lot of factors that have played into that happening. White nationalists, though, are able to come in and say, well, it's the immigrant that stole your job, and it's the Jewish banker that's coming for your home. Far-right groups also really believe they have this access to a higher truth. And so that means that they, again, going back to those conspiracy theories, believe that they're really the only ones, as they look out into the world, who really understand what's going on. And they're the only ones who really understand what's at stake. And so, again, they're processing what's happening in the world through these conspiracy theories, where kind of dropping down to that use of fear, where as they look out in the world through these conspiracy theories, there's always, always, always someone, a them, that is coming after the us. So dualism. Far-right groups really view the world as being as people, and everything that happens is inherently good or inherently bad. When it comes to white nationalists, they literally view the world in black and white. So there's no gray area. And then finally, the manipulated nostalgia. Far-right groups are always talking about wanting to go back to a time in history that they think is better. Now, oftentimes, the way that they view the world through that historical lens either didn't exist, or what they want to go back to is a time of white dominance, where white people had all the power, where they were able to do and treat people of color however they wanted, and where members of the LGBTQ community were in the closet and would never talk about those feelings. So it's sort of this manipulated nostalgia of either trying to go back to a time period that didn't really exist, or if it did, was only really good for white people. So you have this far-right ideological construct that impacts our communities in various ways. And so frames are just a notion of that's how we look out into the world, and we generally do try to take kind of complex happenings, and we use frames to try to understand and interpret them. So at MHRN, we have a few that we use quite often. So one is the idea of a funnel cloud. And maybe this is more of a metaphor than a frame. I guess we don't have to really argue about that right now. But what we mean by a funnel cloud is one of the questions that we get asked all the time is, why do people join these groups? Why are they attracted to these ideas? And one of our founders, Ken Toole, came up with this idea of it's like a funnel cloud or a tornado cloud. So if you think of a tornado cloud way up in the sky, so the big end at the top, people get pulled into these groups and these movements for all sorts of ideas. They really like their guns, and they're scared people are going to take them away. They're scared of people of color. They think that, you know, immigrants and refugees are going to kill American, meaning white, culture. They're mad they don't want to pay their taxes. They're mad about environmental regulation. They're upset about something. So people get pulled into that top end of the funnel cloud. Now, a lot of people will kind of hang out at that big end of the funnel cloud, and then we'll sort of spin back out into more of the, you know, mainstream conservative movement area, taking a little of this, what I would call political education, with them. But for people that stay in the funnel cloud and start to go down in the funnel cloud, what happens is they only start taking in information that really backs up this emerging worldview that they have. Again, this emerging worldview through these conspiracy theories. Now, as people are going down in the funnel cloud, you can move up and down through the funnel cloud, and, you know, spin back out and come back in. So there's a lot of movement in there. But then what happens is if you have people that go all the way through the funnel cloud and come out that other end, what you have are people like Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, or in the last few years, a lot of the white nationalists that have gone on shooting sprees in this country, where all of a sudden there are people that pop out that other end who have embraced this ideology, believe these conspiracies about us always being under attack, and decide to go out and act on it. So some other frames. I mentioned margins to the mainstream, and this is this idea of how these far-right ideas, these anti-government ideas, these white nationalist ideas, make their way into the political mainstream. So I borrowed this picture that you've probably seen on social media with in various meme form to sort of to try to get you to try to represent that idea visually. So I think there are a lot of people that really feel that that car that represents white nationalism stays on that road out to the far right and out to the fringe, and that white nationalism exists out there somewhere. And so, like, they're out there somewhere, the rest of us exist over here, and there's no interaction between the two. Frankly, that was an idea that existed in many people's minds before 2016 for reasons that we'll get into. But the reality is these ideas don't just stay out on the far right and the fringe. They routinely make their way into the political mainstream, and we'll see a little bit today about how that happens. The potential for violence. I mean, we have had many examples during the time period that we're talking about today of white nationalists who have gone out and committed violent acts in communities across the country. So that's always a concern. And then there's the idea of, you know, white nationalism being a threat to the idea of inclusive democracy. as we'll talk about more, white nationalists really do truly believe that it should only be white people that have rights, that have political power in our communities, in our states, and in this country. So those are some frames that you can kind of keep in mind as we go through. So the next piece I just want to touch on briefly is, what is white nationalism and how is it different than white supremacy? So white nationalism was basically a term that originated back post-1960s, so post the civil rights era. And it started in the South basically as a euphemism that was used for white supremacy. But by the late 1990s, you started to see white nationalism emerging as its own separate political and social movement. And, you know, I think that the piece of it that is important to keep in mind is, as a social and political movement, it's this broad umbrella term. So it encompasses what I would say most people consider traditional white supremacist groups like the Klan, all the way through people who would, you know, really be appalled at burning a cross on somebody's lawn, who are much more interested in using public policy, using academic sounding language to push, again, what really comes down to these white nationalist ideas. And a big piece of this is white nationalism is based on the idea that we should have white ethno-states. And in America, white nationalists believe that America was founded to be basically a whites-only country. So if white nationalism is a social and political movement, white supremacy you can think of as a system of laws. So like it says there, white supremacy is a political or socioeconomic system in which white people enjoy a structural advantage or privilege over other groups on both a collective and individual level. So while white nationalism is a political and social movement, you can think of it in those terms, and white supremacy then becomes the system of laws that keep white supremacy promoted and keep institutions benefiting white people over color. The other piece to white nationalism is, I think people inherently get the race piece when you talk about white nationalism, but it's also really important to remember and understand that anti-Semitism is a huge driving force of white nationalism. Again, go back to the 1960s. So, you know, for centuries, white people had been thinking they were superior to people of color. Well, after the success of the civil rights movement, these white nationalists are sitting there having to figure out, like, well, okay, if these inferior people, as we have defined them, have won, and now we have, you know, the Civil Rights Act, and we have, you know, the crumbling of segregation, and all of these victories, it really was impossible for them to sort of take in and accept and understand in this worldview that they have, because how could these inferior people have beaten us? So it came down to, well, it couldn't really be them that beat us, that there had to be some sort of secret puppet master behind the scenes, somebody behind the scenes that orchestrated this whole thing. And so that then comes down to, oh, well, then we go back to sort of these hallmark, long-standing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that then it becomes Jewish people who are these puppet masters who are pulling the strings of the civil rights movement. And so as this disgusting cartoon shows, really white nationalists continue to think that Jewish people are behind any kind of progressive movement, you know, whether that is, like it shows here, whether that, you know, is work around, you know, justice for immigrants, whether it's LGBT rights, whether it's environmental, whatever it is, it then becomes, you know, oh, that it's the secret cabal of Jewish power brokers that are really the ones behind all of these advances that have been made. So this slide that was created by our friends at Western State Center is just, again, another way of thinking of white nationalism as a big umbrella movement. So you have, you know, kind of four quadrants here, where you have those groups that tend to use political or legal tactics towards the top, those that use radical or violent tactics at the bottom, and then you have, coded racism on the left, and then more overt racism on the right. And, various groups then fit differently into these different quadrants. And again, this is just sort of a way as we go through today where you'll see groups and activists that basically fit into different areas in these quadrants. All right, so I'll make an announcement. All of you that were at part one that haven't been listening, if you're interested in new material, it's starting now. So during this time period we're talking about, you no doubt started to hear and see in print terms like alternative right or alt-right. So the alt-right is basically this collection of far-right groups and activists whose core belief is that white identity itself is under attack. It's under attack from multicultural forces, it's under attack from political correctness, from social justice, from all of these different ideas that they believe are out there to undermine white people and white civilization. So it's really characterized by this heavy use of social media and online memes. Followers tend to be fairly young, and again, they really embrace this need to create white ethno-states. Really, at its core, the alt-right represents an attempt to repackage white nationalism for the social media era. So one of its big strategies has been to come up with memes and hashtags and social media content that starts to go viral, starts to be shared around all over the place to get their ideas out there. And part of that, again, is sort of trying to figure out new ways to try to repackage some of these long-term white nationalist, anti-Semitic ideas. So the term alt-right and sort of the social media focus is new, but what the alt-right is trying to do is not new at all. I mean, you really can think of it as the white nationalist movement's latest public relations campaign that's geared towards trying to influence today's social media. So where, 30 years ago, white nationalist groups were largely focused with trying to deal with how they were represented in print media and how they were represented on the nightly news. As we all know, social media is where lots and lots of people go these days to get their information. And so the alt-right is really the white nationalist movement's attempt to influence and gain traction on social media. But that sort of new approach, old content piece is one of the reasons I really like to throw up here this, this quote from the Associated Press that they issued back in 2015 or 2016 to journalists about this term alt-right, because it gets at that old and new. Avoid using the term generically and without definition, however, because it is not well known and the term may exist primarily as a public relations device to make its supporters' actual beliefs less clear and more acceptable to a broader audience. In the past, we have called such beliefs racist, neo-Nazi, or white supremacist. And that's really, what the alt-right is about. Oops. So, okay, that's a little bit about what the alt-right is, but where did it come from? So the term itself was coined by a guy named Richard Spencer, who I'll talk more about later. And he coined it in 2010. And again, very much in sort of that white nationalist mindset, he saw it as being a social and political movement around promoting and protecting white identity. Now, to create these ethno-states, or, to make America a white ethno-state, he has talked about wanting a quote-unquote peaceful ethnic cleansing, quite the term to use, but a peaceful ethnic cleansing to happen that would leave America as a whites-only country. So he comes up with this idea in 2010, and it's being discussed in white nationalist circles. Eventually, it starts to get picked up and starts being discussed on social media platforms like 4chan and Reddit and sort of other web forums and areas where users can largely post anonymously and there really aren't any rules. You know, people can essentially say and do whatever they want. So that starts to happen. Then as we get into 2014, you have this thing called Gamergate that happens. And it again originates from some of these same platforms like 4chan and Reddit. And during this, you had young men who were using these platforms to attack female game programmers, you know, who they derided as social justice warriors, and claimed that, you know, these women programmers were injecting feminism into video games, and that was just totally abhorrent and, you know, shouldn't be allowed. And so while it starts very much targeted in the gaming world, it also blossoms into, you know, these claims that feminism and the media were colluding to push these ideas that targeted men and tried to diminish the status of men. So feminist bloggers are described as being, quote unquote, agents of hate. Feminism is discussed as this disease that's trying to destroy Western civilization and diminish basically this idea of this birthright of men. And within that, basically diminishing the ability of men to do whatever they want, whenever they want. So on social media, as Gamergate happens and continues, you start to see these young men activists start doxing their perceived enemies online, and in some cases issuing death threats. So that is a very quick and not, you know, not a lot of details, but that's sort of Gamergate in a nutshell. Now, what starts to happen years later is that many of the leaders of the alt-right, as we get into this 2015 and forward time period, is that many alt-right leaders talked about how they had already been active on 4chan and Reddit and other such platforms and had started to dabble in more racist and anti-Semitic material online, but that then they became sort of radicalized and politically educated and were part of the Gamergate issue. So that doxing of perceived enemies, the threats, the misogynistic ideas that really came to a head during Gamergate ended up really transferring over to the alt-right as it's really starting to emerge during this time period. So from that birth in Gamergate, you really see, you know, these prominent alt-right activists not just pushing racism, not just pushing anti-Semitism, but also pushing very misogynistic ideas. And so you continue to see this overlap between the alt-right and what you could call male supremacists, or people that are called incels, which stands for involuntary celibate, who have made the news for shooting sprees that they've gone on during this time. And you can think of like male supremacy and the incel movement, again, as just being the grossest things you can think of when it comes to misogyny. I mean, these are ideas where, you know, these men view women as only having value because of their reproductive ability, that they treat women like property, that they think that rape should be legalized, and that, you know, there should be no domestic violence laws because how could you be arrested for doing something to your property? It's really, you know, the grossest, most disgusting ideas you can think of kind of represent that world of male supremacy. So again, Gamergate ends up being a huge part of sort of the mobilization, radicalization, and political education of many of these people who end up being prominent leaders of the alt-right. Now, a great example of this is this guy, Andrew Anglin. So this was a quote from something he wrote about, "Your worst enemy is not Jews, white man, but your own females." So Andrew Anglin was one of these people who had been, you know, hanging out, participating in sort of the white nationalist, anti-Semitic circles on places like 4chan and Reddit, and then became really active in the Gamergate issue. So born and raised in Ohio, Anglin glorifies Hitler. I mean, he's written that throughout the day, he likes to ponder, quote unquote, what would Hitler do? He's encouraged his followers to prepare for a coming race war, and circulates memes, again, with incredibly disgusting content, with slogans like, gas the kikes, the race war is now. And, in his writings, he's urged his followers basically to continue those practices that he first learned during Gamergate of doxing enemies, of threatening people. And the people that he targets are Jewish people, people of color, Muslims, women, liberals, journalists, basically anyone who agrees with him. So his popularity really skyrocketed when he launched his website, The Daily Stormer, in 2013. So the Daily Stormer is a reference to an anti-Semitic newspaper that was published by a Nazi in Germany during World War II. So given Anglin and his history, it's not surprising to find out that the Daily Stormer traffics in racism and anti-Semitism and misogyny and outright neo-Nazism. And for quite a few years after it launched, it was the leading white nationalist site online, which there used to be a site called Stormfront that was like the #1 site for decades. And all of a sudden, the Daily Stormer was surpassing it as far as users and people who were engaged. Now, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit more later, the Daily Stormer now lives more of a whack-a-mole type existence. And what I mean by this is they continue to get deplatformed. So it'll go up for a while, and then the hosting server will basically kick it off. And so it'll be down for a while, and then it goes up for a while again, and then it gets deplatformed. And so it's kind of lived that existence for the last couple of years, for reasons that will become apparent in a little while. But the other thing that made the Daily Stormer and Andrew Anglin so significant is that the followers of this website were people that he was able to rally to take action, and they called themselves trolls, and they would have these troll storms, which would perpetuate online harassment against these targeted groups and people. And I believe, one of the other pieces that made, Anglin's impact so much was it wasn't just limited online. It wasn't just that he could get his online trolls to take action, but in fact, there have been multiple white nationalist people who have gone on murdering sprees during this time period that were avid fans of his site. So Anglin, who we'll talk a little bit more about later, and the Daily Stormer, again, are this great example of how the alt-right, as it really emerged and found its footing during this time period, had this mix of racism, anti-Semitism, and misogyny. I say pretty much if you can think of what most of us would consider society's worst characteristics, you will find it commonly on the Daily Stormer. But again, it comes down to, why should we care now? If these are the same basic ideologies and beliefs out there that have been here for centuries and they're not new, why should we care? I, have been doing this work roughly for about 20 years. And there, are people around the country that do this work. And we have constantly been screaming over time about how white nationalism ideas are not these fringe ideas that stay out in the far right, that they come into and impact the political mainstream. And one of the things that happened during this time period that we're talking about is that interaction, that margins to mainstream dynamic when it comes to white nationalism got to the point where no one could look away. No one could claim that it didn't exist. So let's go back to 2016. So in 2016, you started to see candidates at all levels that were using white nationalist talking points and rhetoric. And this included at the presidential race level, as Donald Trump in the primary started to really cultivate this relationship with various white nationalists. Now, as Trump and others started to talk about the issues that white nationalists cared about, and even more beyond that, started using similar language even, this made white nationalists see an opportunity to really try to engage and push their ideas into the mainstream political debate. And it really became kind of a two-way street. So again, back to that alt-right focus on social media, that's often where you saw this playing out, and especially on Twitter. And these two screenshots kind of show that dynamic. So Richard Spencer, who I mentioned earlier, who coined the term the alt-right, had this tweet saying that, Trump provided hope for this country. On the other side, you've got Trump retweeting the hashtag white genocide, which again, when I talked earlier about sort of repackaging white nationalist ideas, white genocide is one of their big, what you could call PR campaigns. It's this idea that diversity and multiculturalism and all those ideas are a campaign to destroy the white race. That's what white genocide means. So this retweeting dynamic then has played out again and again and again over time. Now, the fact that a campaign running for the highest office in the country would retweet content from a white nationalist every once in a while, that actually isn't that surprising, or candidates, at all levels doing that. But generally, historically, how that has played out is, say, someone running for president might do that, and then when they were called on it, they would immediately denounce it in very strong language. And say, we had no idea, this is the source that this was coming from, we have nothing to do with white nationalism, it's bad. But that doesn't happen, and we'll talk about that a little bit more about candidate Trump and then President Trump in a bit. So what that did was, over time, when you have, again, the person who ends up taking control of the highest office in the country, talking about your issues, talking about them in very much the same language, it normalizes and legitimizes white nationalist content and ideas and beliefs, really to an extent that we have not seen in modern times. And it allows white nationalists then to say, well, we can't be extreme or dangerous when the president, when that person running for the US Senate, when that person running for the state legislature is using that same language and talking about those same issues. So given all of this, it's not surprising that white nationalists viewed this time period as a time to really try to push their agenda and push it into the mainstream, and that's what they've done. Okay, so this slide, Simone and I tried this out earlier, and when I embedded it in the program, it made it so you couldn't hear the video clip that I'll play, so I'll be sort of exiting out, playing it, and coming back in a second. So bear with me as we do this. But okay, so we go back to the 2016 election cycle. And like I mentioned, it's not that there hadn't ever been a candidate who used a lot of white nationalist ideas in their campaign. If you go way back, think of the George Wallace presidential campaigns, the segregation now, segregation forever message. You think even back a little bit closer in time to the 1990s when Pat Buchanan ran. He was really one of the first people that ran on a lot of pretty open white nationalist ideas and messages. But generally, again, what has happened is those folks will make some noise in the primary season. And then as you get more towards the primaries and farther into the primary process, those folks kind of drop out. And whoever goes in, to the general election then generally isn't the one that's been spreading these views. That's one of the things that made the Trump campaign very unique, was that white nationalism was a central part of his campaign. He won the primary, and then he ends up winning the general election and becoming president. Now, you may remember that there were a lot of people after the election that said things like, well, President Trump used white nationalism as a campaign strategy, that he did that to get elected, but he will moderate now once he begins running the country. And as we've seen, he clearly didn't do that. And in fact, in many ways, he really doubled down and made white nationalism a driving force of his administration. And again, he started using these talking points and really prioritizing issues that white nationalists have wanted for decades. And you saw this manifested in many ways. So you think of the focus of his immigration work, building a wall along the southern border, going after sanctuary cities, increasing deportations. All of those types of activities are things that the white nationalists have wanted for a long time. If you remember, one of his first public policy initiatives when he took office was issuing the first of what became multiple Muslim travel bans. Those are a few examples. There are many more. So again, you have him pushing these ideas using similar rhetoric to what the white nationalist movement has done. But again, not necessarily the first, politician, elected official to do this. But another significant difference, again, was this unwillingness to condemn white nationalists and white nationalist ideas when asked to. Now, there were many, many times that he was asked to do that, and he really never would. And I think one of the clearest examples, again, was around the so-called quote-unquote unity rally in Charlottesville in 2019 that was the largest gathering of white nationalists in this country in decades. So this was the rally where you had the white men in polo shirts and khakis and tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us, white lives matter, blood and soil." This was the rally where a woman was killed by the white nationalists. Now, again, the normal presidential response is to pretty quickly issue a strong condemnation of white nationalism. So Trump instead waited a couple of days and then ended up making the statement that I'm sure people remember, where he basically said there were good people on both sides in Charlottesville. So these incidents keep popping up where he's asked to make statements or specifically to denounce white nationalists, and he basically refuses. And when he does, it's sort of like he'll make a throwaway statement about, oh yeah, Nazis are bad. And then we'll pivot to generally a talking point around that, well, where the real violence comes from is the political left. So Charlottesville was one example of this, but we saw this again very recently in September 2020 during one of the presidential debates. And so I'll go ahead and play that clip here.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
to
specifically
do it?
Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call him? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing.
FBI director
This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacists. Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you got to be
not
kidding.
militia. That's what his FBI, FBI director said.
Well,
Okay, so again, this process has played out numerous times. So when asked to, condemn, in this case, both white nationalists and militia groups that have been active in communities, instead of saying just it's bad, that they should stop, he says stand back and stand by. And then again claims that real political violence comes from the left. Now, as Biden points out in that clip, as Trump has continued to make those statements, his own FBI has affirmed over and over again that white nationalists are, in fact, a domestic terrorist threat. And let me tell you, the Proud Boys, as far, again, as a group, that wants relevancy, that wants high public exposure, they were so excited with what the president said that they were immediately pushing social media content out with their logo and the comments by the president. So again, I guess just to wrap this up, when it comes to sort of the current administration and what they've done, I actually think the Southern Poverty Law Center summed it up really well in a quote I read the other day in one of their publications that said, members of far-right extremist groups increasingly responded to President Trump's dog whistles and calls to action this year being 2020. Trump ran his campaign on stoking racial divisions within the United States and was the first president in 70 years to publicly stand on the side of white supremacy and refuse to denounce racism. So this white nationalist influence wasn't an accident, and it didn't happen spontaneously out of nowhere. So from day one in the White House, you had Trump and his administration appointing white nationalists to positions throughout the government. Some of those inside the White House, some of them at other agencies. And this publication I have here by the Southern Poverty Law Center called Hate in the White House was something that they kind of did on an ongoing basis up through about 2019 that you can check out for more examples. But literally from day one, you had staffers in the White House who had long histories with white nationalism and the alt-right. So you had Steve Bannon here, who's pictured at the top, who joined the Trump campaign and then became an advisor in the White House for a while before he eventually left. So before joining the campaign, he was the head of something called Breitbart News, which he talked about, which he actually called and described as the quote-unquote platform for the alt-right. And I think he's a good person to talk about how the alt-right does exist on sort of this continuum. So many hardcore white nationalists like Andrew Anglin don't necessarily view Bannon and some of the other folks that were appointed to the administration as being really true alt-right. They oftentimes will describe these folks as alt-light. And what they generally mean by that is these are folks who don't necessarily buy into or promote the whole alt-right agenda. And mostly that comes down to they think less of these people because they won't specifically use blatant racist and anti-Semitic talking points and outwardly call for the creation of white ethno-states. But what they recognize is that these are potential allies, and that while they may use different language and different tactics and different strategies, that they're all basically pushing in the same direction. So middle photo, a guy named Sebastian Gorka, he had a long history working with really anti-Muslim groups before coming to the White House. These are the types of groups, I'll talk a little bit more later about them, but that really claim that all Muslims are terrorists. His family actually had these long-standing ties to a Hungarian nationalist group that was allied with the German Nazis back during World War II. And he was somebody that while working at the White House, he would claim that white nationalists weren't domestic terrorist threats. Again, at the same time that the FBI was saying, yes, they are. And then finally, the bottom photo is Stephen Miller. So Stephen Miller has really been the brains and the driving force behind a lot of the anti-immigration policies that the administration has pursued. And while Bannon and Gorka eventually left, Miller has been there basically the whole time and generally is now recognized as one of the sort of central advisors to the president with quite a bit of power. So as I mentioned, both Bannon and Gorka left, and there were a lot of people that were really excited about that. And yeah, that's a good thing. But I think it's important to remember that there have been people throughout the administration that continue to push these ideas. And in fact, there's been some media coverage since Election Day that the president has continued to appoint and has appointed a couple more white nationalist positions in the government since Election Day. But again, I think I always like to be clear that, yeah, having a Bannon, a Gorka, and whoever these people are leave the government is a good thing. But I think people can trick themselves into thinking that, oh, if we can just get rid of those people, everything will be fine. And the reality is that these ideas are around and have influence and have power to move and inspire people on their own. So it's not just as easy as, oh, well, there's some bad people out there, and if we remove them from power, everything will go back to being good. It's not quite that simple. So I did want to give a few examples of the alt-right that we've seen here in Montana. So really the most, I would say, notorious and infamous alt-right activist here in Montana that's had a real big national profile is Richard Spencer, who heads up a group called the National Policy Institute based out of Whitefish. So Spencer really was able to rise to this national level for quite a few reasons. I think one is he has defied the stereotype of what most people think a white nationalist should look like. I mean, I think that so many people carry around this notion that if you're a white nationalist, you have a shaved head and neo-Nazi tattoos all over, or that you're a middle-aged, balding white guy in a Klan robe, you know, that likes to burn crosses on people's lawns. I think that's the stereotype that a lot of people have carried around. Well, Spencer really defies that stereotype. He's clean-cut, he's smart, he's educated. He has a master's degree from the University of Chicago. He was actually pursuing his doctorate at Duke before he basically left the university to work in the white nationalist movement full-time. So part of the reason he gained this national profile was he was very active during 2016, trying to push those alt-right views into the mainstream political debate as the election season was unfolding. So he was famous for that. I also think that he's mostly famous for two other things. So after Trump was elected, there was a video that The Atlantic put out of him giving a speech, I believe it was at a National Policy Institute event, where at the end he does this huge like pro-Trump kind of scream into the mic and gets the crowd fired up. And as the camera is panning through, some of the members of the audience are standing up Sieg Heiling as he's finishing his speech. That got around a lot, and a lot of people saw that. But I think the other thing that he's very known for is getting punched in the face. And so you can find video clips all over of him giving interviews to the media on the street, and literally people will run up and punch him in the face. I have to admit that on some long days, you know, when I'm feeling tired, I have been known to go watch those videos. I would also like to say that I do not support the idea of running up and punching people in the face. But anyway, so Spencer gains this big profile, and he also has kind of an interesting connection to some of the white nationalists who served in the administration. So he went to Duke at the same time that Stephen Miller was going to Duke. And Spencer has claimed that he clearly influenced Stephen Miller when both of them were at Duke, and that they helped put together and sponsor speeches and some events like that while they were both on campus. But he also will say that, you know, he believes that Stephen Miller still would have risen to the levels that he has if he had never met Richard Spencer. You know, but so that's kind of an interesting connection. So really, you know, back during that like 2005 through 2015 through 2018 time period, Spencer was really riding pretty high. He was considered this intellectual leader of the alt-right. But his status has diminished a little bit in recent years. And so during 2018, he had spent, and this was again another way to get attention, he had done this, what he called this college tour around the country. And basically the way that he did it was he invited himself to campuses, and he would give these speeches, and they would create these big spectacles where you'd have, you know, a small group of Nazis that would show up to support him. You'd have these huge counter-protests. Spencer and the Nazis would try to say things to get the counter-protesters to attack them, because if they did, then Spencer and the Nazis get to talk about how they're the victim and try to get people to feel sorry for him. But he eventually called that off. And when he suspended his tour, he basically said, you know, I'm just not having fun anymore. And so he quit the tour. But around that same time, he was going through a divorce. And frankly, his wife was a very smart, incredibly capable woman who had white nationalist leanings that we always suspected had really helped Richard create this persona and maybe had helped him, with some of the writing and some of the speeches. And it's kind of left me wondering, and I have no proof for this, but if part of his decline in status may be due to the fact that his now ex-wife was a big factor in helping him create the Richard Spencer that had that national profile for a couple of years. So another example of the alt-right in Montana is a group called the American Identity Movement. And it's a group that, when it was initially founded and for many years was known as Identity Evropa. And while it was known as Identity Evropa, it was one of the most prominent alt-right groups in the country. And it was often said that Identity Evropa liked to portray itself as, quote unquote, the fashionable new face of white nationalism. And it was really a group that stuck to those alt-right roots of social media. What they like to do is have a small group of people stage basically a racist flash mob, or they'd hang these incredibly long banners over highway overpasses. And so they would do these things that they could then create social media content to push out into the world. And again, their whole kind of talking points and idea are based on, they are here to preserve European American, so white, culture. And the group generally has targeted college campuses, and what that has meant is that most of their membership are angry young white men. So on this slide are a few photos from actions that they did and posted about on social media here in Montana. Up in the top left, you've got this small group, again, that held kind of this flash mob demonstration up in Kalispell in front of a couple of well-known landmarks. In the top right, you've got a couple that actually lives up in the Kalispell area, taking a picture of posting some flyers in Missoula. You can see, not really here, but that's Washington Grizzly Stadium in the background. In the lower left, picture of some literature that was dropped at Carroll College in Helena, and then the bottom right, some lit that was dropped in Red Lodge. And so for quite a few years, we would find their literature being dropped in numerous communities multiple times, and especially in Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula, mostly targeting the colleges that were in those areas. We really think that there was sort of a small cell of activists located out of the Billings area, thanks to a group called Unicorn Riot that's kind of a lefty hacker group that likes to hack in and publicize and messages from their private message boards. Thanks to them and going through and looking at the Montana stuff, it also looks like they had a regional coordinator that would come through and sort of help with these lit drops. So again, back when it was known as Identity Evropa, the national leadership at that time was heavily involved in organizing the Charlottesville rally. So the current leader was the one that decided to rebrand the group as the American Identity Movement, specifically to try to distance the group from all of this bad PR and baggage that has come with being affiliated with the Charlottesville rally. But the current leader has also talked about he really wants to focus on trying to recruit, if I can get the word out, to recruit young people from more mainstream conservative circles, including the GOP. And you can see how a group name like the American Identity Movement would be, potentially helpful on that front. Okay, so during this time period, we have really the rise of and influence by the alt-right. We also have people at the highest level of our government embracing and promoting white nationalist ideas and using their rhetoric. So one of the other things, because of all of that we have seen, again, during this 2015 to current time period, is that it doesn't just create room for Richard Spencer and the American Identity Movement, but it also just generally increases this environment that really breeds racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and opens the door for its expression. So we have seen a big increase in the amount of white nationalist literature dropped in communities around Montana during this time period. Now, sometimes it does, in fact, relate back to an organization, like that one up in the top corner, promotes a group called the Creativity Movement that I talked about during the first presentation, and actually the same in the bottom left. But then you also have these more general flyers that are not connected to a group or an organization. But what they all have in common is all of them are targeting community members who they would see as quote unquote not fit to live in or exist in a white ethno-state. So it's about targeting those people, targeting people of color, targeting the Jewish community, targeting the LGBTQ community, targeting those communities that they ultimately want to exterminate. So that's really, when you're talking about nighttime lit drops, that's more the impact than them actually really trying to recruit. So Identity Evropa, or the American Identity Movement, like, they're trying to recruit on college campuses, but for the most part, this type of lit that's dropped isn't about recruitment. It's about creating fear. Oops, okay, so again, a lot of what I've talked about up to this point are expressions of white nationalism and white nationalist groups and activists that are pretty blatant. You know, even the ones that, you know, are in the White House and things like that, that use a little bit more sanitized language, it's still pretty blatant, or at least pretty easy to see the racism or anti-Semitism that sort of underlies what they're talking about or their policies. But I did want to take a minute to talk about a few other movements that really fall under that umbrella of white nationalism, but are often really viewed as being more mainstream movements. And so the first one is the anti-Indian or the anti-Indigenous movement. And really, the movement has two primary goals. The first major one is this eradicating tribal sovereignty. It's about getting rid of treaty rights and really destroying tribes, destroying tribal government. Then the second piece is what they would call assimilation, but really is just cultural genocide. And it's this idea that Indigenous people are American citizens and they should act like American citizens, and that there's this push around Indigenous folks should leave their cultural history and traditions behind. So back in 2000, a long time ago, we issued a report called Drumming Up Resentment that looked at it was really the first look at the anti-Indigenous movement here in Montana. And in that, we had this statement that we said the anti-Indian movement is racist by definition because it's an effort to deny legally established rights to a group of people who are identified on the basis of their shared culture, history, and tradition. Well, not surprising, a lot of the groups and activists that we mentioned in that report were not really happy about that characterization. And so two of the anti-Indian leaders here in Montana sued us over the report. Eventually it was settled. We didn't have to change anything that was in the report. But what I think is interesting is during that process, during a deposition of one of these anti-Indigenous leaders, he actually agreed with our definition. And our attorneys basically did a thing where they were like, would you consider an effort to deny legally established rights to Irish people who, you know, are identified blah, blah, blah? And it was like, well, yes, that would be racist. And then they even substituted in tribes. And this activist was like, well, yeah, that would still be racist. So, you know, I always like to say that it can be kind of a controversial definition, be it even at least one anti-Indian leader agreed with it during a deposition. So the anti-Indigenous movement, you know, well, I guess let me back up a little bit. So from the time that we put out this report in 2000, we would occasionally get calls from people who would say, hey, do you think that these groups should be labeled as hate groups? Once we get into that 2015, 2016 time period, you had more organizations, activists, journalists, academics, and others who started to use that term hate group, more and more frequently. And so we started to get those questions more often, and we eventually put together this issue brief that the front of is pictured here, sort of outlining our case, why we do think that anti-Indigenous groups should be categorized as hate groups. So this movement works really easily with other movements. It'll work with the white nationalist movement, but it also works very easily with, especially like the Montana Republican Party, anti-environmental efforts, and all sorts of other movements within the right wing. And you will find these groups active really anytime you have a tribe that's trying to exert its treaty rights. You'll find these groups in opposition. So Elaine Willman is really the most prominent anti-Indigenous activist here in Montana and really in the Pacific Northwest these days. So she has long time been active with really the biggest anti-Indian group in the country, a group called Citizens Equal Rights Alliance. So she served as their chair for quite a few years. And basically she travels around giving slightly, different versions of what I would call her stump speech. But major points include treaties aren't constitutional, that they're dead language, and therefore tribal sovereignty isn't real. She'll make statements that are sometimes blatant, sometimes a little bit more couched, but are basically Indians should embrace their US citizenship and just be glad that America's European founders didn't exterminate them totally. And then, within sort of the last few years, she started to ratchet up this talking point about how she believes that reservations will be the staging grounds for the next terrorist attacks by Muslim extremists. So these are the types of messages that she goes around Montana and, into Idaho, into Washington, and elsewhere spreading. So she moved to Montana back in 2005, specifically to fight the Flathead Water Compact, which she said could potentially launch a second American revolution. These are a couple of examples from Facebook that really show her embracing and promoting much more blatant white nationalist ideas than she might in other circles. So you have the one, you are white, your ancestors did not steal this country, they built this country. And again, this gets at this white nationalist idea that white people are the only ones capable of creating civilization. And then on the second one, when is White History Month, that little logo up in the corner, 100% white, 100% proud. This is a slogan that you find on white nationalist merchandise, especially more like neo-Nazi, music distributors and things like that. So during this time period, we're talking about 2015 forward, there have been a few different, flashpoint fights that the anti-Indigenous movement has been involved in here in Montana. Kind of big ones over that time period are around the Flathead area that have involved the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes trying to take over management of the National Bison Range and trying to get their Flathead Water Compact ratified. It's been interesting over the last year or so that these activists who definitely live on the political right have really been going after U.S. Senator Daines for sponsoring a bill that would basically resolve both of these issues. So it would ratify the Water Compact and would transfer the Bison Range to the tribes. And so it's really been sort of interesting watching the people that are part of the anti-Indian movement trying to navigate that with somebody that they have generally considered an ally. So another area I just wanted to mention involves anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, and anti-Muslim movements. And the reasons that I'm kind of grouping all of these together is in Montana, it's really the same activists and groups that are active on all three of those fronts. And frequently there's sort of a unifying conspiracy theory that they share, which is this idea that all non-white immigrants and refugees are part of a Muslim strategy to eventually conquer America and topple Western civilization. So Paul Nachman is one of the consistent activists on these fronts. He has called refugees parasites. He has claimed that non-white immigrants aren't compatible with American culture. And again, he cut his political teeth working on these issues in California, where he did a lot of work around statewide ballot initiatives targeting the immigrant community, and also worked really hard to try to get conservation organizations to adopt anti-immigrant ideas and language by talking about those issues in terms of overpopulation and birth rates. So since moving to Montana, he frequently writes for an online publication called VDARE. And what that stands for is Virginia Dare, which white nationalists claim was the first English white child born in America. And it's worth noting that VDARE is categorized as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So Nachman has also started a state chapter of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR. So this is really one of the largest, most influential anti-immigrant advocacy groups in the country over the last decade or so. FAIR is also categorized as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Nachman's group is called Montanans for Immigration Law Enforcement, or MILE. So during this time, you also had many groups pushing anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia in the state. And many of these efforts could be traced back to a group called Flathead Act for America, which is now called Last Chance Patriots. So it was a local affiliate of a group called Act for America. And again, Act for America is the largest anti-Muslim group in the country, also categorized as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So when I say anti-Muslim or Islamophobia, what I mean is these groups and activists are driven by a worldview of strident opposition at best, but really an overt hatred most of the time of Muslims. And often the ideas and kind of the worldview that they have are driven by conspiracies, by stereotypes, and by misinformation. And part of this is a belief that you'll hear them express often, where they believe that Islam is a violent political ideology, not a religion. And again, that followers of Islam are all dangerous extremists trying to destroy Western civilization. Now, I know I keep repeating destroying Western civilization, and I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, these activists and these groups actually use that language. So from that worldview, they end up, I think, operating with a sense of paranoia that I've started to call a jihadist around every corner worldview. I mean, where they really feel like Muslim extremists are coming, in this case, to Montana. If you're Elaine Willman, they're gathering on reservations. But, you know, that Muslims, who they defy as all being extremists, are gradually, you know, increasing their numbers in this country and will eventually take it over. So we ended up writing this report that's shown here on the slide that goes into the activities of the group. And one of the things they did is they brought this long list of anti-Muslim and other far-right issue speakers into Montana. And they would normally like either start or end up in the Flathead, but they would tour around and visit other communities as well. And again, I mean, just the Islamophobia piece is all about equating all Muslims to being terrorists. And I think a lot of us that grow up in Montana may not have met Muslims, may not have met followers of Islam all that much. And so one of the things I like to say is, if you use that logic, that means that Aryan nations and the Klan represent all Christians. So this is a kind of a mindset or a way to think about this. I think that more people in Montana that we can understand. So if you think about it, Aryan nations and the Klan are these, you know, domestic terrorist groups, but that claim that they are Christian, that base a lot of their ideas on their interpretation of Christianity. So basically, if groups like Act for America or Flathead Act or these activists were talking about Christians in the same way, that is what they would be saying. And rightly so, the vast majority of Christians would be incredibly offended and upset by that. That is basically what these groups are doing to the Muslim community, is calling all of them terrorists. So we've seen these groups and activists push legislation targeting Muslims, targeting immigrants, targeting refugees. Many times, while those might be the groups that are being targeted, the way that potential legislation is written would impact all people of color in the state. But we've seen them push bills during the legislative session, and it will not surprise me at all if we see those ideas popping up again during the 2021 session. Okay, so like I said last time, my organizers, the organizers that work for my organization, get to go into communities and talk about all this great proactive work and get people energized and excited. And I'm always like, I'm Travis, and then spend a bunch of time talking about issues that you could call wah-wah, that are kind of depressing. And so I always like to end, hopefully, with some hope. Because the reality is, these ideas and these groups do have a history in Montana. And I think most people are aware of that. And I know that people around the country are aware of that. But what I always like to say is what's not often recognized enough is that our communities have a long history of standing up and pushing back against these groups. So this picture is actually, and I'm going to talk more about this, but from some organizing that was done up in Whitefish back in 2016 to fight back against a troll storm. And I just think that the sign is great. Zieg fail. I always say it would be even better if Zieg was spelled correctly. But that idea is true, that our communities don't just sit there and take this. Our communities organize and fight back. So during the first presentation, for those of you that were on, the real world example I used was in 1999, when this group called the Creativity Movement was at the height of its power, how the communities of Missoula and Superior responded during that summer to the Creativity Movement coming to town. So the example that I wanted to use for this time period is from Whitefish. And this is something that many of you probably remember, or at least remember pieces of. So in December 2016, Andrew Anglin, so the guy we talked about before, and his website, The Daily Stormer, unleashed one of their troll storms on Whitefish. And they did this by publishing the personal contact information about members of the Jewish community and other members of the community as well. So other members of the community included, business, human rights groups, city council members, basically anybody that started to speak up and speak against Anglin and the stormer. So as Anglin starts to mobilize his trolls, he's writing things online about, hit them up, essentially dox these people, threaten these people. And the central target became this local realtor, Tanya Gersh. And her family received over 700 harassing and threatening phone calls, emails, texts, and voicemails. And again, these are just hideous things that are being said to this family. I mean, one person told her that, white nationalists could keep the Holocaust alive by burying Gersh and her family. Anglin circulated memes online, like the one here, that showed Gersh and her son at the gates of Auschwitz. There was another one that showed a picture of Gersh's son being crushed by a tank. So during this troll storm, Anglin published, 30 or more articles encouraging his followers to harass these various targets in the community. So he also didn't appreciate the work that we in our local group up in the area were doing. He liked to refer to us as the Jew terrorist group. And our staff, also received threats, including people telling us that we were better off as human fertilizer. So again, this campaign goes back to that alt-right focus on social media and that alt-right focus on using social media to prompt people to take action against perceived enemies. So as this troll storm is going along, Anglin also announced that he had this plan that he was going to bus 200 armed skinheads into Whitefish for a march on Martin Luther King Day in 2017. However, he said that they wouldn't be celebrating Dr. King, but they'd be celebrating the guy who assassinated Dr. King. So all of this horrible, 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 horrible stuff is going on in the community, okay, that's targeting the community at large. It's targeting individuals in the community. And thankfully, the march never materialized. But in the face of all of this, the community came together and pushed back, and they won. And they didn't just win. Really, the community response that was put together has been referred to as a gold standard. And these are a few quotes from a media article that actually described it that way. And I think the big key to the response was using multiple tactics and multiple strategies. So you had multi-issue, multi-constituency organizing going on. And our local group up in the area, Love Lives Here, was a big part of this. And what I mean by that is we weren't just trying to mobilize supporters of human rights, like people who self-identified like that. We were reaching out throughout the community and doing education to make people understand what was at stake here and why it was so important that the community come together as a whole and work together and push back. And so that work looked different depending on where you looked, okay? So there was work being done on multiple fronts. So MHRN, we were doing tons of the opposition research. So we were trying to track what was being posted on these websites. We were doing public education around who is Andrew Anglin, who is Richard Spencer, what is the alt-right. You had local governments passing non-discrimination resolutions where local leaders during those discussions were talking specifically about the alt-right and the presence of Anglin and Spencer in the community. You had huge public events for the community where they could come to, where the community could get together and show kind of in force that Andrew Anglin and the white nationalists don't represent them. And so many public events were held. And then you also had not just local, but statewide leaders who were issuing statements and pledging their support, to the people being targeted and praising the community for the response work that it was doing. So there were all sorts of different, pieces of work being done. There was a strategy at work to try to come up with multiple ways for people to tap in and be part of that response. But in the most simplistic way possible, what you had were people showing up in all sorts of ways for their neighbors and for their community. And it worked. So eventually, Anglin's troll storm kind of dies down. Thank goodness the Nazi march doesn't happen. But that wasn't the end of the story of the troll storm that targeted Whitefish and targeted the Gersh family. So Tanya Gersh teamed up with the Southern Poverty Law Center and filed a civil lawsuit in 2016 against Andrew Anglin to hold him accountable for how what he had posted online mobilized his trolls, his supporters, to take action against her family. Now, around this time and since, Anglin was already facing similar litigation because this troll storm event in Whitefish was not the first time he had done something like this. And so facing a bunch of litigation, he fled the country, or at least claims to be living abroad. And what this meant is he really was not part of his own defense in the Gersh case. For instance, he refused to show up in person for a deposition. And really his whole defense that his legal team was using was just trying to say that threats and harassment were protected as First Amendment speech. But in August 2019, U.S. District Judge Dana Christensen ordered Anglin to pay $4 million in compensatory, I said that wrong, damages and $10 million in punitive damages to Gersh The judge also ordered that Anglin permanently remove all of the content he had posted and was still on his website targeting the Gersh family. So Anglin eventually did that, took that material down. But truthfully, the chances that Gersh will see any of that other money is pretty slim. But the important piece about this, and the important piece of Gersh and her family saying no, like, okay, Anglin may have moved on, but no, he has to be held accountable for what he did, is that this case helps set a precedent for people like Anglin that says you can be held accountable. You can be held accountable for what you put out in social media and what people responding to that do in real life. So this is one of the memes that we've used over the years to show both our support and our admiration for the bravery of the Gersh family. So as I mentioned, so Anglin has had kind of a series of these judgments involving, fines and orders to pay money in other areas of the country as well. And that's part of the reason that, as I mentioned before, the Daily Stormer lives kind of a whack-a-mole existence now. Like, it's up and then it's down. It's online, then it's offline. But I think it's also interesting to notice that, so Tanya worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center. SPLC has been one of the main groups in the country, over the last, 40 years or however long they've been around, that has really tried to use civil lawsuits against white nationalists to hold them accountable for what they do and what they promote and encourage other people to do. It's worth noting that right now there is litigation against the planners of the Charlottesville rally that continues to go on. And while for years the Southern Poverty Law Center was the only group doing this, I think it's really exciting to note that there now are other national organizations that are starting to use this tactic as well. Okay, so over the 30 years we've been doing this, there's some lessons that we've learned. And just want to sort of end with this, and that is that cross-issue, that cross-constituency organizing and work is really important, and it needs to be done over time for a couple of reasons. One, most of the issues that we at MHRN work on here in Montana aren't prioritized by national funders. For instance, if you're a national foundation, are you going to give money to MHRN to work on immigration, or are you going to give that money, to organizations on the border that are doing that work? So resources are always limited in Montana. So that's one of the reasons that organizations and people need to work together. But those relationships need to be developed and worked on over time. Now, oftentimes, well, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes those relationships will start out of a crisis. Like the white nationalists are doing something in a community, people come together, they fight it off, and then it's important to keep those relationships going. And it's important over the long term because both the leaders of organizations need to develop relationships, but also organizations need to explain and educate their members about why this kind of cross-issue, cross-constituency work is important. The other thing is, Montana, as you may have noticed, is a huge state geographically. It's a huge state geographically with not a lot of people. What that means is when it comes to winning, so much of the good work that happens in our community is done by talking to people face to face. But because Montana is so big, part of what we need to do is look at providing opportunities of both identifying and training leadership in communities across the state to help keep this work going over time. So since we have a lot of affiliate groups, it probably doesn't surprise you that we think that those local human rights groups, those local-based groups, really can have an impact. And they can build this base of support that's ready for these crisis situations that happen. And they can do that through, doing community education work. We can do that through providing research. We can work on proactive measures, and then that cross-issue organizing and building allies. the proactive piece there, and I mentioned this when I talked about MHRN's own evolution as an organization, the proactive piece is important. So it is no doubt incredibly important for communities to respond to white nationalist activity. But we also need to be willing to go out there and get together with our people and organize and think about the work that we want to do to make our communities and our state better places, and to figure out how you want to do that work locally. So responding is so important, and we have to do that. But we also need to start thinking about how do we take our vision for our communities, for our state, out there and start pushing that ball forward. So just a couple last things. If you go to our website, we have basically an online form where you can report whether it's finding literature or graffiti or whatever that might look like at this link that says report here. It's a great tool. It's so helpful when people use it to let us know what's going on. We also have this rapid response guide that I have kind of a small copy of on the next slide that we made with our group Love Lives Here after the troll storm, and tried to boil down like, okay, what were the key significant pieces to the response and why it worked, and boiled that down into an infographic that you can find on our site. And then finally, if you want to stay up to date with us, you can sign up for our action and alert email things on our website too. So I know you're not going to believe it, but I'm actually going to finally stop talking. Here again, so over on the right is just that rapid response guide I mentioned. And if you're interested in these issues, check out the resources we have on our website. But organizations like Western States Center, the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, Political Research Associates, and the Southern Poverty Law Center are all great places that you can go and learn more about these issues as well. So with that, thank you for hanging in there. And yeah, I guess we can kind of go to questions. I'll kick it back to Simone to see if she has anything she wants to say here.
That was really interesting. Thanks so much, Travis. And I really appreciate your tips on how to respond to these groups and just encouraging people to take agency in their communities. Before we go to questions, I'll allow people to unmute themselves soon, so you can chime in if you have any thoughts, anything to say, or have any questions. Firstly, we're going to take a little bit of a break for the holidays. I don't have any events lined up next, but we do have some things in the works that I'm pretty excited about. If you'd like to stay in the loop, I do have a Facebook page, Exploring Montana's Racial Landscape, where I post updates, interesting articles, petitions, so you can find me on there, and I'll also be posting a recording of this lecture as well. So with that, let's move on to questions.